begin? Great.
Great. So today I'm going to talk about downsizing transportation infrastructure to increase community wealth. And this isn't all sort of high tech and all exciting. Some of it's pretty low tech, but I think there's a lot of potential for cities to do this, to actually increase their community wealth and actually lay the groundwork for more effective public transit and other innovative technology. And some of this involves trying to undo a lot of the work that we have done over the last, say, 50 years. So I'm going to start with just a very simple anecdote here. Under the theme that every piece of community infrastructure should increase community wealth. Whenever we invest in anything, we ought to be able to evaluate its benefits across multi-criteria. And this little anecdote is about John Norquist. When he was mayor of Milwaukee, the city engineer wanted to use eminent domain to take a gas station to widen an intersection. And Norquist asked the engineer whether he wanted to retire with a pension. And the engineer said yes. And then Norquist asked him, why do you want to destroy the city's tax base? And this is a theme that kind of runs through my presentation, is that the engineer had a simple perspective. His idea was that that intersection ought to be what they call level of service D or better in the afternoon peak hour, which means that no vehicle would have to wait more than 40 seconds for a green light. And that overrode any other consideration about what might be good there. And that's a very limited perspective that has really kind of ruled city transportation planning for a long time. So we really need a different approach when we're considering new infrastructure, rather than just, will the project improve congestion and can it be funded, which is kind of all we've really been thinking about in many cases, is we need to think about, does the project really add value to the community? And one of the simplest ways to measure this is in tax base. You know, when we remove that gas station, we're removing tax base. We can also think more about accessibility than just mobility. Accessibility meaning, you know, while, you know, it's not great for somebody in a car to wait 40 seconds or more for a green light, what about those people who don't have a car or can't use a car, either because they can't afford it or because they're not able to do that, or they're too young or too old? You know, what are we doing for them? Safety has been, as people are trying to walk more now, pedestrian fatalities have been a big problem in many cities in the country. Part of this is, again, the vehicles are getting bigger, they're hitting people higher up, they're more likely to kill people. And just a whole lot of quality of life issues. I've only listed a few here. One is, you know, what about public space that really makes a city livable? Air pollution, with global warming. Heat has become an increasingly big problem. The areas that have the most pavement, you know, we're getting excess fatalities now just when areas get too hot in the summer. And then something that's gotten too little attention is, as we build out infrastructure, can we actually afford to maintain it over the long run? We look at a lot of our cities where there's been population decline. You know, some of the larger ones include Detroit and Kansas City, but a lot of smaller cities too. I'm working in Shreveport right now. And the infrastructure is still there. The streets are there, but there's fewer people there to pay for them. So we have to think about, how are we going to keep paying for our infrastructure as well? And we should also be very skeptical when developers come in with auto-oriented development and try to sell this as a big advantage. And a really good source of this information is Strong Towns. I have a list of places you can go for more information at the end. But this is an example that Chuck Marone, who started Strong Towns, used from his own community of Brainerd, Minnesota. And this first map here shows two areas that are the same size, one of which, the one on the left, was considered old and blighted, and the one on the right was considered shiny and new. And then when we look at the reality of these, is the one that's the old and blighted one that's shown a part of on the top, is full of all these little shops. You know, there's barber shops. There's various offices for local business people. I think there might even been a pawn shop in here. And you look at the value of that land is $1.1 million on the tax rolls. This nice new shiny one, because it's mostly parking and is otherwise not a very expensive building either, it's a taco drive-in restaurant, is only $620,000. It's actually providing less tax base than the one on the top. It's creating a lot more traffic than the one on the top. And because it was new and shiny, they gave it 26 years of tax abatement, which isn't justified. So again, just be skeptical of when people come. And this is a small example, but this is very much true of big box stores, Walmarts and Targets and others. You look at it, it's a cheap one-story building surrounded by a sea of parking. It provides very little tax base per acre and causes a lot of traffic issues. Walmarts are so, these big box stores also need a lot of police presence and other support. So just be skeptical and certainly don't necessarily feel like you have to give them tax abatement. Now, the result of you know, taking these filling stations and widening intersections and requiring a lot of parking and allowing older buildings to come down and be replaced with parking lots. This is what most cities look like today in the United States. This is an example of Little Rock, Arkansas, which is one of the areas I've worked. And what we're seeing here, this is the downtown. Just to orient you for anybody who's familiar with Little Rock, I borrowed this graphic from this person, Charlie Gardner, and he cut off some of the things that might make it easier to understand where we are. The Arkansas River is to the north and just off this, outside this area. There's kind of an expressway running across the top edge that's between the, there's a little bit of land use beyond the river, but the river is not too far there. On the south, we have I-630, which I'll be talking about on another slide. And to the east, it's I-30. And you can just see a little bit of that in the upper right-hand corner where you see a loop ramp there. But I-30 is right off there too. And so these kind of border the downtown. We're kind of stuck between the two interstates and the river on three of the sides. And so the downtown, the red area is all surface parking, 27% of all the area. And then there's also some garages, not as many, but another 2.7%. And then the streets, including the sidewalks, are another 32%. So we add all this up, 61% of this area is involved with streets and parking. And so if we can imagine that even half of the surface parking could be converted to more productive uses, this would represent an increase in non-infrastructure use by 35%, meaning we could increase tax base a lot. And this is definitely one of the places, one of the phrases Kevin used in the introduction was transit-oriented development. A lot of these parking lots are ideal places to put that because you're not having to tear down people's houses to do that. And a lot of them are relatively large. And so that's a good area to look for multi-use transit-oriented development. I did mention that I-630 was running to the south of Little Rock, and I want to talk a little bit about the history of that. Before that was built, this area where it got built was 9th Street, which was the important Black business district in Little Rock at the time. And this shows, again, you know, a lot of smaller buildings, you know, dense use. The way things were built back then, this is showing it in 1959. Obviously, we're not using a lot of this for parking. You know, this was walkable. This was essentially the sort of stuff we're trying to recreate now when we talk about transit-oriented development, mixed use, walkable neighborhoods. We're trying to get back to that. And it got wiped out. And this actually happened in most, I'd say most cities in the US. The areas where these urban freeways were built were typically the redlined areas where, or in many cases, minority business districts. One of the things I heard, and I didn't really go back and study this real carefully, but when There was talk about the Tulsa massacre. It was one of the anniversaries of that, and how terrible that was, destroying the business district there. My understanding is that got rebuilt after that, but then it was ultimately destroyed by a freeway project. And these freeways that have gone through these cities, they're just incredibly destructive, partly even because they tended to be at these oblique angles. So they wouldn't even just sort of keep themselves within certain city blocks. They'd, break up the grid in strange ways and create all kinds of weird parcels that weren't very useful. And that's a legacy we're dealing with. And we are trying to sort of start rolling some of this back too. In the case of Little Rock, they haven't learned much though. This is under construction. They're taking I-30, which is the one to the east, and they're widening it from 6 lanes to 12 lanes across the Arkansas River. And this is particularly damaging to the city of Little Rock because what we're looking at we're kind of looking across the river at North Little Rock. But on the southern side of the river, we have the downtown Little Rock on the west side on the left. And we have on the east side is where they built the Clinton Presidential Library, which is a kind of a great attraction. And, that people should be interacting closely with the downtown, but there's this huge problem in the middle here. They've sort of promised the city that there's going to be a park underneath this, and that's going to be the amenity. Doesn't look like a great amenity to put a park under a 12-lane highway. So we need to consider to change our planning approach to include downsizing too. So the way that we've tended to work a lot is what I call business as usual. It's there, so we leave it. We kind of ignore that. We think that that's a permanent feature, but we have to start thinking about what can we change? And can downsizing add value? Can we increase tax base? Can we increase accessibility? Can we increase safety? Can we improve the quality of life? And can we reduce the long-term maintenance costs of maintaining the infrastructure? And a good place to start a project, I think, is really with parking reform. And these days there are dozens of cities that are engaged in some form of parking reform or another. It's a long-term activity because you're not going to replace all that parking overnight. But here's some of the best practices. One is to remove the minimum parking requirements. We kind of strangely require homes for cars, but not homes for people. It's been estimated that in the US, there's 5 parking spaces for every car, so that everybody can, no matter where they put their car, they'll always have an open parking space. And we just don't need to do that. We don't need to require it, because if somebody's coming in and putting in some kind of business or housing, and the parking is really essential, they're going to figure out a way to provide that to their customers. We can also charge demand-based parkings for off-street, demand-based prices for off-street parking to optimize occupancy. One of the great things that happens in mixed-use environments, including the transit-oriented development, is you have a lot of shared parking. So that rather than building one parking space for the house or the apartment and one for the business for work and another one for the supermarket, all those uses can share the same parking. We can, rather than give commuters free parking, we can give them the option of taking money instead. That's allowed by the IRS. We can even start thinking about converting garages into apartments, because we need housing, and we need a lot of small housing, which is really an unmet need in most cities, small apartments. We can charge demand-based prices for on-street parking and use the revenues to finance public services on the metered blocks. Some cities have successfully implemented projects of that sort. And another problem has been when the way we've managed things is we have made it relatively easy in most cities for people who have a building that may not be generating a whole lot of revenue to basically just tear it down and have a parking lot there and not pay much in taxes. And that's still actually really making a major demand on city services, because there's still a street there, and there's still, water and sewer and all those things. So we need to, there's strategies for that too. And some of the resources I have at the end give some ideas for how to approach that. We also can reallocate street space. That can involve narrowing travel lanes to add bike lanes or wider sidewalks. A common form that's been popularized is called a road diet, where you take a 4-lane street and make it into a 3-lane street with a center turn lane. And that way you can have enough space for bike lanes and maybe wider sidewalks. Some larger cities can really benefit from bus lanes because if the buses are stuck in traffic, it really increases the cost, because the buses, a lot of cost is labor. And if you can make them more efficient, it both improves the ride, but also it saves money. And you can replace parking spaces with parklets or cafes. And that's been done in a lot of cities during the pandemic, a lot of when people wanted to eat outside. And some of those places have been really, very popular. And cities have learned that maybe they didn't need that parking as much to begin with. You can also consider closing some streets to parking traffic and converting that to public space. And then reconnecting communities. This gets us back kind of to the big infrastructure, the freeways, these urban freeways that were built through cities and really destroyed neighborhoods and have created all sorts of adverse impacts, noise, pollution, separating people from one side to the other. And there is now federal money to try to turn a little bit of this around. It's not enough yet, but both of the 2 infrastructure bills that passed this year have some money for what's going under the rubric reconnecting communities. And this is an example that just got funded by the feds. Detroit's Paradise Valley was a buzzing nightlife district, home to jazz clubs and hundreds of other Black-owned businesses. Then urban renewal plans launched after World War II, and the digging of a highway through the area displaced more than 100,000 residents. Today, there's nothing left of that, really. And they've been trying to deal with this for years, and Detroit has a grant now to remove that road and replace it with I haven't looked at the real plans, but a lot of these cases, again, it's to try to replace it with streets and mixed use development that fits this rubric of transit-oriented development. I think in all this, I started with the example at the beginning of the engineer who had one idea that vehicles shouldn't wait more than 40 seconds at a traffic signal. And the idea that basically the engineers have sort of held that that is some sort of sacred duty of theirs to enforce that on the community, and that, you don't consider anything. I mean, that trumps anything else. So I've started to call that engineer's privilege because it seems very arrogant. And so again, we need to consider much more wide effects on community wealth. We need to consider all travel modes, and we need to consider the quality of life. And then transit, we talked about transit-oriented development. Obviously, we're also trying to do transit. And sometimes we've talked about in the field, we also talk about development-oriented transit. Some of the areas that have put in streetcars and other targeted transit lines have been to encourage that sort of development. So it is good to do them together. But to do transit, we really do need to do a more general makeover. We can't just kind of retrofit transit onto our auto-oriented development pattern. We need more density. We need to price parking. We need better and safer pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure, because almost all transit trips have a walk trip on both ends. And so because of that, when you look at sort of aggregate mode shares, transit mode share isn't usually more than half of the walk mode share. If you don't have a good walkable area, you're not going to get much transit ridership. People have to feel safe getting to and from the bus stops, in addition to having the bus or the train or the streetcar getting you from where you need to go. So we really need to do a lot of those other things I was talking about rebuilding the community before we're going to expect that transit's going to be highly successful. And then at the end here, hopefully this will be available afterwards. I have just a whole lot of places where you can get more information about the things I've been talking about. Is that going to be available for later on for people to get to?
Yes, yes, I will make sure to include that in our follow-up email. these resources.
All right. Then should I just stop my sharing at this point?
Yeah, that's fine. Appreciate you, Norman. I think that was very informative. Understanding just the historical perspective and breaking down on a technical aspect and understanding the challenges and barriers and how we need to be very intentional on the outcomes that we are trying to build. So I know everyone learned a lot when I was learning too as well. I feel like a student right now, so that was great. So thank you. Now we have another bright individual, Dr. McBride. She, do you have power to share your screen? Oh yeah, you do. I'm sorry. Oh, there you go.
All right. Hopefully,
cool.
Should be in presentation mode now.
Yes.
Okay. All right. You want me to go ahead and begin?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So I was asked to take kind of a different route in terms of my initial presentation. So I am essentially going to give you a little bit of information about our research center. Well, it's not just a research center. We have other aspects as well, but this presentation will focus on the research element of our University Transportation Center. So I am the director, as was mentioned in my introduction, of the Center for Advanced Transportation Mobility. So that is a university transportation center that was funded through the FAST Act in 2016. And our focus of our center is on improving mobility of people and goods. So you see here on this particular slide, it indicates some of the other focus areas or research priority areas that other centers may have listed as their primary, but we were specifically interested in improving mobility of people and goods. In terms of some of the things, the topical areas that we cover, there's a lot of writing on some of these slides. I'm gonna, of course, the video will be available to you, but I'm not going to, of course, read every single word that's on the slide. So I just wanted to kind of give you access to this information through the video so that if you want to get more information about our center, you know how to access that. So essentially what we're interested in is making sure that there is more equity in terms of connecting communities to one another, as well as to the essential elements that they need to survive, and not just survive, but to live well. We have elements of smart cities in our research that I'll kind of touch on as I go through some of the projects that are being conducted within our center. We also look into multimodal connections and system integration, and there's some security elements that are being tapped into with our research projects. And we have several topics that are looking at assistive technologies, because one of the main areas that we focus on is on vulnerable road users. So that includes pedestrians, bicyclists, but it also includes people who have mobility challenges, or some people say disabilities. And then, of course, we have a lot of data modeling and analytics that go on within our center as well. Now, we are a little unique in two ways in particular. North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University is the lead institution of this consortium. So we do have two other consortium members, Virginia Tech's Transportation Institute and Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in Daytona Beach. But we are actually the lead. So as a HBCU, we are actually one of only two HBCUs that are leading these, the current university transportation centers. And not only that, but I believe we are probably the only one that is actually housed in a college of business. So within our College of Business, we have our supply chain management concentration, and we also have several transportation classes that are taught within that particular concentration. But my background is industrial and systems engineering, as you heard from my introduction. And because I come out of the College of Engineering, I connect a lot with our researchers and faculty members over in the College of Engineering. So we have a lot of engagement of our researchers over in the College of Engineering, even though we are housed in the College of Business and Economics. And the Transportation Institute is our umbrella organization under which we fall. So as I mentioned, Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University and Virginia Tech's Transportation Institute are our consortium members. And our theme is ensuring mobility, particularly for vulnerable populations. So that entails making sure that there is safe and efficient mobility for those vulnerable road users. And I just have a few visuals over there to kind of give you some examples, get a little chuckle hopefully out of the pedestrian crossing one. But these are some of the populations that we're interested in making sure that we are providing mobility solutions for them as well. But on the other side, with a lot of our optimization work that's being done, it's for emergency situations. So for instance, we just had this Hurricane Ian that came through. As a matter of fact, it blew down several of my trees and I had a lot of cleanup to do. But in Florida, they were devastated in some places. So I even heard about some of the communities where the people could not get out in time, and there were a lot of fatalities because of that. So how do we go about making sure that there are mechanisms in place to that people can actually get out in those emergency situations? And that could be weather related, or it could be man-made situations. So I'm just going to really quickly flip through a few of our projects so that you can kind of get an idea of what goes on within our research component of our center. So what I'm hoping that you get out of this in terms of the HBCU Mobility Challenge is some of the topics that you might want to think about or consider as you are engaging in, or as the students start engaging in the challenges that they are, or the problem statements that they're presented. So as I mentioned, we do a lot with vulnerable road users. So this is one of the projects that's being led by Virginia Tech's Transportation Institute. And so what they're looking at is last mile, first mile connectivity, but in particular, using an automated shuttle to help provide transportation for elderly individuals. So in particular, they were focused on their initial research focused on retirement village and seeing how can they improve the transportation access that these retirees have to the essential elements that they need to live well. So they were looking at how can it improve the mobility of these vulnerable road users, particularly elderly and disabled as well, and determine how well the vulnerable road users would accept these types of automated vehicles. So, considering they're an older generation, not necessarily used to all the technology that the younger generations have lived with all of their lives, would they be willing to put their lives in the hand of a vehicle that's operating without a human operator present? So that was some of the things that they looked into. So of course, acceptance of these vehicles was one of the impacts of this project. Integration, solving the integration issues that elderly individuals might have in terms of their connection to society, and just a lot of benefits and challenges that they found out in terms of how these vehicles would be implemented. So they created a document, and all these projects, these first projects that I'm talking about, they are completed and they have their final reports are actually on our website, our center's website. So I'll provide that link at the end of the presentation as well. We also have a project that was looking at creating an app for individuals who have mobility challenges. So it's supposed to help them to navigate through the built environment. So these are people, for instance, who have movement disabilities, or they may be in a wheelchair and have to navigate on sidewalks that may be broken or inaccessible without ramping to allow them to cross streets and whatnot. So it would help them to find a proper route that would enable them to navigate successfully from point A to B. And using augmented reality was a key part of that. So that project is just wrapping up. So its final report is not yet on our website, but it should be posted hopefully before the end of the year. The key thing, one of the potential impacts, is that it looks at some of these environmental elements within the built environment that can cause constraints to an individual's ability to navigate from point A to B if they have mobility challenges. So that was one of the key elements, in turn-by-turn directions, just like you would get for your vehicle, or even using the iMaps or Google Maps, but with this augmented reality that can help them to better navigate through some of the obstacles that might not be considered obstacles to a person without any mobility issues. Then this project actually was an add-on to that previous project, and it was just adding some additional elements for route planning and also transit options for the vulnerable road users as well. They worked through one of our North Carolina organizations, incorporating the bike and scooter and wheelchair options. So it was just basically beefing up that application. We also had a project that looked at the non-driving mobility needs of people who have disabilities. So as I said, we're looking at vulnerable road users who could be pedestrians, not necessarily inside a vehicle. And so this particular project was looking at some of the barriers and opportunities for mobility for people who may have different types of disabilities, not just physical disabilities, but also perceptual and intellectual disabilities or limitations as well. So this one, the final report is actually on our website, and you can find several different recommendations that they made in terms of considerations that should be made for people who may have mobility challenges. We also had a project that looked at, autonomous vehicles. There's been a lot of talk of when, they're going to be universally available to all. I came back from California from a conference not too long ago, and it was the first time I had been in the presence of so many Teslas. Now, I don't know how many of them were actually operating autonomously, but it was just kind of mind-boggling to me that it's almost here. It's almost going to be, it's becoming more and more prevalent that these vehicles are going to be on the road, not just individual, passenger vehicles, but also the trucks that are autonomous as well. So this particular project was looking at pedestrians' willingness to interact with these vehicles and their general perceptions of these vehicles. So they conducted several different studies, and of course the results are in their final report, but the results are intended to help vehicle manufacturers and urban planners consider various elements that should be taken into consideration in the design and implementation of these autonomous vehicles. We also have a project that was completed that looked at pedestrian evacuation, in particular looking at from an emergency evacuation of an airport. So when an airport shuts down, how do they get everybody out in an emergency situation, considering pedestrian movement behaviors? So this one, again, was an optimization modeling problem, and they were looking at different factors that may influence people's movement. So not everybody is going to move in the direction that they're being instructed to move. So what are some of those human factors that come into play that impact people's mobility choices, or evacuation choices? I mentioned the hurricane. This particular project actually looked at fuel shortages and the impacts of fuel shortages on hurricane evacuation processes. So again, project report is online, but essentially it was a modeling problem where they looked at how can policymakers make it more convenient, I guess you could say, or more easily for people to more easily evacuate, considering the gas limitations, because when a hurricane comes, that means that a lot of those gas stations are not fueled to capacity at that time, because those fueling tanks have been encouraged or discouraged from moving into that particular area where the storm is coming. So how do those fuel shortages prevent people from being able to evacuate it in an efficient manner? And then this project is looking at using drones to be able to manage and assess various emergency situations that occur on the highway, for instance. So the Drone TIM project is basically more of an aerial vehicle project that is still optimization in nature, but how can they improve mobility and safety to reduce traveler delay and decrease the possibility, of secondary incidents that occur often when there is a traffic accident. So usually you end up not just with one traffic accident, you end up with multiples that occur because of that initial accident. So this was using drones to help to decrease the likelihood of those secondary accidents. And this one was another emergency evacuation project looking at how to use intelligent transportation systems during the emergency evacuation process. And I'm almost done with the projects here, but ultimately what I'm hoping that you'll see is that there's different things that need to be considered when you're looking at trying to modify various transportation systems. If you're looking at a specific type of community, for instance, within our center, we have us in North Carolina, we have researchers who are in Florida focusing on some of the issues that take place in Florida. And we also have our partners up in Virginia who have different issues. They don't typically get hit with hurricanes like we do in North Carolina and in Florida. And so looking specifically at the types of issues that are encountered by the communities that you are planning to modify their transportation systems is important. So this one here was looking at disruptions in transportation systems during those emergency situations and how to alleviate those disruptions to the best of their ability. And this one in particular was looking at flight scheduling. And this one, again, was more along the lines of the secondary accidents that can occur on a highway when an initial traffic accident occurs. And I'm going to flip through here. So this one here is actually just giving you a couple of additional, I wanted to touch on just a couple of additional topics that were not related to those that are finished projects. The ones that are in green are finished as well, so their final reports can be found. I think this one might relate somewhat to what Norm was discussing in terms of pricing for certain types of transportation infrastructure. So equitable dynamic pricing for express lanes. Not everybody necessarily should have to pay the exact same amount of money to use those express lanes. So as they are right now, no matter what your income level, essentially you're paying the same amount of money to utilize those types of benefits. So that means that many people with lower incomes are not able or capable of using those benefits because they are priced out of their range. We also have some situation awareness with pedestrian safety. We have a lot of electric vehicles that are very quiet. And so with the implementation of these vehicles, how are we helping pedestrians better perceive that they are in the presence or about to cross the street with a vehicle that is approaching them if they aren't able to necessarily hear the approach? So those are some of the human factors things that we are thinking about in terms of our projects. We also have, teenage driver projects that are looking at making sure that we train them properly in the early stages of their driving using a web-based driving feedback mechanism. We also have a project where individuals who have dementia are able to, we're able to detect the dementia using their driving behaviors. And just various other elements that are related to more of the human factors and vulnerable road user side. And then again, these three projects are completed, looking at more evacuation. Urban air mobility is one of our additional projects that was just recently completed. And these others are very close in line with some of the ones that I already talked about as well. So of course, because of the pandemic, we also had a few projects where we were looking at the impact of pandemic on our transportation systems as well. And one of them, it has been completed. The other two are still in progress right now. So like I said, essentially, I just wanted to give you an overview of some of the projects that our researchers have been working on in order to give you a broad base of ideas to consider whenever the students start engaging in their projects for the HBCU Mobility Challenge. And hopefully, this kind of opens their minds up a little bit if you communicate this information to them, or if they're on this, viewing this video, it opens their minds up to some additional things that they might want to take into consideration, not just necessarily the infrastructure itself that's associated with whatever design challenge they may be presented. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Wow, this is so great. We're about to just move directly to our Q&A. I know a lot of you guys probably need some time to process a lot of the information from Norm and Dr. McBride. So I would just want to just open the floor. I know we have one question in the chat. This is from Karen, and this is for you, Dr. McBride. What is the relationship between this research, the data-informed recommendations that come from the center, and civic engagement? In other words, what is the life cycle from research to implementation, and what is the role of community engagement in that?
That's an excellent question. And I think that's one that the UTC program has been particularly interested in trying to address, because sometimes that life cycle can be very long, because you have to get buy-in from the people who are actually able to implement these projects. Now, in many cases, we try to establish that on the front end. And so before the projects are even funded, they have to show that there are some stakeholders who are interested in whatever the results of those projects are and can potentially move them forward into implementation after the results have been acquired. Other times, that's not necessarily the case. So for instance, with the automated shuttle project, they already had a stakeholder who was interested in identifying whether or not that shuttle was something that can be implemented in their community, in their retirement village. And so unfortunately, because of the pandemic, we ended up with some issues with the testing, because we could not have the human to vehicle interaction that was originally designed for that project. But we were still able to conduct the project using focus groups and interviews that were conducted through Zoom, for instance. But we're moving forward in terms of trying to identify communities that might be able to utilize those devices. In terms of the optimization models, those really require the participation and of other members of the transportation community to put those into practice. So we have our researchers working with individuals, for instance, at the North Carolina DOT, to actually implement the optimization models into the systems that they have. So yes, it can take a bit of time to get that going, but when we are able to design that in at the front end, which is what we're trying to do more of now, then that life cycle or that lead time is shortened.
Thanks. And this is actually great for Norm. In your experience, how has community engagement factor in when you think about downsizing infrastructure?
I think it's very, very important. There's one thing that's coming up right now is that there is a part of this, the new federal infrastructure, there's reconnecting communities. There's a request for proposal out, and that's due sometime next week. And I'm working as part of two teams, one proposal for taking a freeway down in New Orleans, and another one that's more general planning work across several cities in Texas. And both of those proposals are going to, if they were funded, they'd have extensive community involvement. I think what's been unfortunate is, again, this has been both when the freeways were constructed and even today, the departments of transportation are not listening enough to the immediate community. They're prioritizing really the desires of suburban drivers over the people who live next to these facilities. And we're trying to change that. And the new federal law is moving in that direction.
Thanks. Thanks for sharing your insight. David, you have your hand raised. You can unmute yourself.
Thanks, Kevin. I think this is an open question, maybe more suited for Mr. Marshall. But I'm sure, Dr. McBride, you have some insight too. I'm wondering if there's a connection between the affordable housing or lack thereof in many dense and urban centers and traffic congestion, and whether or not there's any research to suggest that the lack of affordable housing is increasing traffic congestion. Anecdotally, it seems like the fact that people are unable to afford to live where they work, means that they are forced to live outside of working centers and have to commute. And, in a lot of places, those commutes are not via public transportation. And I wonder what kind of impact that's having. If there's any data to kind of support what seems to be, obvious, and if policymakers are making that connection and how they're trying to address the two, if you've had any experience with that.
Yes, that is a huge issue. One place that I've done a lot of work in that area is in California. California passed something called Senate Bill 743 that moved away from that level of service I was talking about the delayed intersections, and said now, because they're concerned with climate, they're reviewing transportation under how many vehicle miles traveled there are. And so this has become a big issue, for example, in central Los Angeles, where they're building hotels that have a lot of service jobs, and people are commuting really long distances to them because, of course, I think everybody knows housing in California is incredibly scarce and expensive. That's an extreme example, but I think that's true across the board. And that's one reason why, and it's very hard. Another place I've worked a lot is Austin, where it's very hard to build more housing in central Austin because the neighborhoods resist it. But this is, again, a case where if you can look at parking lots or old shopping centers, what we call gray fields, even at the smaller scale where I talked about taking a garage and turning it into an apartment, a lot of what we need are just these small, affordable apartments close to jobs. And in all the more successful cities, there's a real shortage close in.
Great. Do you have any insight, Dr. McBride, before we start to close out?
Yeah, I've not had any direct experience with that other than anecdotal, as mentioned before. It does seem like, that's even more of a challenge in rural communities where, geographically people are more dispersed. And so finding public transportation, for instance, for people with lower income trying to get into the larger cities to be able to actually acquire some of those jobs or hold down some of those jobs is more of a challenge. So in rural communities, they have different issues that they have to deal with in terms of trying to meet the transportation needs than they have in the more rural, more urban communities as well.
Thanks. This is awesome. I feel as if we probably needed more time to just share and pick both of you guys' brain and such a wealth of knowledge that you guys have shared with us this evening. We really do appreciate you guys taking your time out. And we want to share our next upcoming event on October 18th. Both you guys talk a lot about inclusion. And G3 ICT is one of our partners for the HBCU Smart City Challenge, and they specialize in inclusion and digital inclusion. So this is right on the same lens of when you guys mentioned about mobility, taking into consideration of the disabled. So check this out. We are going to be including the registration link in the follow-up email. We also love you guys' feedback. We love that a lot of you guys were engaged, informed, and just asking great questions. So we always love feedback to see how we can better improve our events in the future. So my colleague, Dr. Turner, just actually dropped the link in the chat. Just take less than 5 minutes. Once again, we love you guys' feedback to see how we can better improve. But once again, I think this was just amazing. I wish we had more time, Norm and Dr. McBride, but I think we are going to share the resources in the follow-up email so you guys can check it out. But any final words from yourself, Norm, or Dr. McBride?
Thanks for listening.
Yeah, I appreciate the invitation to share some of the work that's being done at within the Center for Advanced Transportation Mobility. And again, I just encourage those who are participating in the challenge or introducing this challenge to their students to get them to look broadly at the community that is going to be affected by the changes that they're recommending.
Awesome. Yes. And I know the students participating in the challenge will love to pick Norm's brain on how he's looking at the problem, and we would love to have more Aggie students. As I say, I'm pretty biased because my older sister, she graduated from North Carolina A&T, so I always remember driving down to Greensboro, always complaining in the car. The long drive from Maryland, so it's awesome. But yeah, but once again, I really do appreciate it. I appreciate everyone for staying on, and this is amazing. We are going to be